Los Angeles, April 25, 1992. Ella Fitzgerald was 75 years old. She sat in a wheelchair at the edge of the stage, dressed beautifully despite everything her body had been through, her eyes behind dark glasses that protected the vision she'd been slowly losing for years. Around her, people moved with the particular quiet efficiency of an event that has been organized with great care. She didn't know exactly what was coming. She knew it was a tribute. She knew people would speak and perform in her honor. She'd been to enough of these events over the decades to understand the format. What she didn't know was what the night would cost her emotionally, or how it would answer a question she'd been quietly carrying for years without fully knowing she was carrying it. Did I really do all of this? Did any of it matter as much as I hoped it? This is the story of that night, of the artists who came, of what they said and sang and revealed, of the moment Ella Fitzgerald, who had spent 60 years being the professional, the polished, the controlled, the one who held it together on every stage, finally let go. And of the question she asked Norman Granz afterward alone when the evening was over and the house was quiet. By 1992, Ella's health had become the dominant fact of her life in a way it hadn't been in earlier decades. The diabetes that had been diagnosed in the early 1970s had advanced significantly. Her eyesight had deteriorated to the point where she was functionally blind. Diabetic retinopathy had destroyed the vision that had once let her read music, recognize faces across a room, navigate stages she commanded for half a century. She'd had bypass surgery. She'd had multiple hospitalizations. Her legs had been giving her trouble for years, the circulation compromised by diabetes in ways that would eventually lead to further surgery. She still sang when her health permitted and when her voice cooperated, but her performing life had contracted enormously from the woman who had toured relentlessly for 5 decades, who had performed 200-plus nights a year through her 30s and 40s, who had treated the road as her natural habitat. The world she inhabited now was smaller, quieter, more private. Beverly Hills, her home, a manageable circle of people she trusted and had known for years, medical appointments, the television, music she listened to rather than made. What you did not see in this smaller world was doubt, not the performative self-deprecation she'd always practiced, dismissing. Compliments with characteristic modesty, real doubt, the kind that visits you in the quiet hours of a life that has contracted, the question of whether what you gave was worth what it cost, whether the decades of touring and performing and being away from normal life and normal connection had added up to something real. She had never been a person who talked about this doubt. Professionalism demanded you kept certain things private, and she was, above all, a professional, but the doubt was there. Had been there probably since that first radio playback in 1936 when she'd heard her own voice and wanted to quit. Had been there through every high and low of a 60-year career, had been there in the quiet moments of a life that had given everything to music and was now, in this final chapter, asking what music had given back, which made the tribute. Feel like an answer she hadn't known she was waiting for. Norman Granz had organized it. Of course Norman had organized it. The man who had managed her career since 1954, who had founded Verve Records to give her the recording context she deserved, who had gone to jail in Houston defending her dignity, who had been at her side through every major professional development of the past 4 decades. He'd made calls. He'd reached out to artists, to colleagues, to people whose careers had been shaped by Ella's work. The response had been immediate. People cleared schedules. People flew in from other cities, other countries. Nobody said no. The venue was intimate rather than grand, not a stadium, not a concert hall with 2,000 seats. A room that held perhaps 300 people, elegant and warm, where you could see faces in the audience. Where the distance between stage and Ella's wheelchair was small enough that she could hear clearly even without perfect vision. Quincy Jones was there, the producer who had worked in the orbit of jazz greatness for his entire career, who had written arrangements, produced sessions, shaped the sound of American music for decades. Quincy and Ella had crossed paths throughout their careers, and his presence at this event wasn't just ceremonial, it was the presence of someone who had witnessed what she'd accomplished from the inside of the music industry. He took the stage first to set the tone. "I want to tell you something about Ella Fitzgerald," Quincy said to the assembled room. "She made it look easy, and I need you to understand that nothing she did was easy. The voice was a gift, yes. But the artistry, the phrasing, the intelligence, the understanding of what a song actually was, that was built. constructed over decades by a woman who took music more seriously than anyone I've ever known. He paused. She also made everyone around her better, not by telling them how to be better, just by being what she was and letting that set the standard. In her wheelchair at the side of the stage, Ella listened. She'd heard tributes before. She was 75 years old. You accumulated these things. But there was something in the quality of Quincy's words, something specific and informed rather than generally effusive, that reached her differently. Tony Bennett took the stage next. He was 66 years old, a man whose own career represented decades of commitment to the great American songbook tradition that Ella had helped define. He and Ella had performed together, had recorded together, had been colleagues and friends across the full arc of popular music from the 1950s onward. Ella taught me what a song actually was, Tony said simply, not what a song was supposed to sound like, what it was, what it meant, what it was trying to say, and what your job as a singer was in relation to it. He looked toward where Ella sat. She didn't teach me this directly. She taught me by doing it, and by doing it better than anyone else, and by making it impossible to listen to a song the same way after you'd heard her do it. He sang for her one song, a ballad, performing with the particular care and attention of someone who wants the recipient of a gift to feel its full weight. His voice, 66 years into a life of singing, carried everything those years had deposited in it. Natalie Cole had come, the daughter of Nat King Cole, the man who had been one of jazz's defining voices of the previous generation, who had died far too young, whose recordings Ella had known and respected, and whose daughter had grown up hearing stories about what the jazz world meant to her father. My father loved her, Natalie said. He talked about her. He played her records. She was the standard he pointed to. So I grew up with her voice in the house before I understood what I was hearing. She paused. I understood what I was hearing before I was 10 years old. You can't not understand it. You just hear Ella Fitzgerald sing and something settles in you that makes you understand what a human voice is capable of. Then Natalie sang. She sang a song her father had recorded in tribute to both of them, to Ella, who was present, and to Nat, who wasn't. The room was very quiet. Ella, in her wheelchair, was managing her composure. The dark glasses helped. They gave her something to hide behind, a small protection. She had been composed through Quincy's words, composed through Tony's song, composed through the first part of Natalie's tribute. But there were more people. The next speaker was a music historian who had spent decades documenting the jazz era, who could speak with specific authority about what Ella Fitzgerald's career had looked like from the outside. Let me give you some numbers, he said, because numbers matter. Ella Fitzgerald began her professional career in 1934, 58 years of performing, over 200 albums, 13 Grammy Awards, named the world's best female vocalist in magazine polls more times than any other artist in history, performances for 8 presidents of the United States, every continent except Antarctica. He looked at Ella. She has also been refused entrance to hotels, required to use service entrances at venues, subjected to discrimination that would have ended lesser careers and lesser spirits. She persevered through all of it without losing the warmth or grace that make her who she is. He paused. The phrase First Lady of Song is not a nickname. It is a precise description, not just the best female vocalist. The first in every sense of that word, the standard against which everyone else is measured. He stepped away from the microphone. Ella's hands, clasped in her lap, were gripping each other. Whitney Houston had come. She was 29 years old, not the 15-year-old who'd stood terrified in a Newark dressing room hearing 7 words that would shape her career, but the Whitney Houston of 1992. Already one of the most successful recording artists in the world, she carried herself differently now, with the particular poise of someone who had grown into their own legend. But in this room tonight she was carrying something else too. The Newark dressing room, the 7 words, the debt she'd been conscious of for 14 years. She didn't tell the full story of that night to the assembled room. It felt too personal, too private. What she said instead was this: when I was 15 years old, someone told me that my voice was something I needed to take care of, that it wasn't mine to do with whatever I wanted, that it was something I was responsible for, that I was accountable for. And the way she said it made me take that seriously. She paused. I've tried. Some days I've done better than others, but I've tried, and everything I've achieved, everything, starts with the fact that someone thought enough of me to be honest about what I had and what it required. She didn't say Ella's name. She didn't have to. Every person in the room understood. Whitney sang. She sang with the voice that had sold hundreds of millions of records, that had become one of the most recognizable sounds in the world, and she sang it in this room as a gift, not a performance. The distinction was audible. She was not performing for an audience. She was singing for a woman in a wheelchair at the edge of the stage. Ella Fitzgerald's composure broke, not dramatically, not in the way composure breaks in films, with sobs and visible collapse, but quietly in the way that real composure breaks, slowly, incrementally, despite all the professional habit and personal pride trained over 60 years to hold it together under any circumstances. Her hands came apart from each other. Her chin trembled slightly. The dark glasses couldn't hide everything, the slight movement of her jaw, the particular stillness that settled over her body when she was no longer concentrating on appearing composed because the concentration had finally failed. She was crying. Quietly, almost privately, in a room full of 300 people, 75 years old in a wheelchair, crying because a young woman was singing to her. Because the young woman's voice carried in it everything Ella had tried to teach without teaching, just by singing, just by doing it, just by being what she was for 60 years and letting that be the lesson. Norman Granz, sitting nearby, saw it. He said nothing. He was not going to draw attention to it, not going to make it larger than it already was. It was hers to have, this moment. She had earned it in ways that he had witnessed over 38 years and that he understood better than almost anyone. He did, very quietly, reach over and put his hand briefly on her arm. After Whitney finished, there was a silence that was different from ordinary silence, the kind that happens after something that requires a moment before the world can continue. People in the audience were not quite ready to applaud because applause would have been a kind of interruption. The feeling in the room needed a few seconds to be felt before it could be converted into sound. Then the applause came, warm and sustained and full-throated, the kind that starts from the chest rather than just the hands. More tributes followed. More words, more music, more people standing before the room and explaining what Fitzgerald had meant to them, to their work, to their understanding of what music was and could be. The evening built layer on layer, tribute upon tribute, each one adding to the weight of recognition settling over Ella in her wheelchair. She accepted each tribute with the dignity she'd maintained throughout her career. She spoke when spoken to, thanked people graciously, held herself together. But the composure that had broken during Whitney's performance didn't fully reassemble. She remained for the rest of the evening, slightly more open than she usually allowed herself to be. When the formal program ended and the room began the gradual loosening of an event winding down, people drifting into conversation, finding their coats, saying their good nights with the particular warmth of shared experience, Norman Granz wheeled Ella to a quieter corner of the room, away from the center of activity. They sat together, the two of them, in the partial quiet of a room still warm with the afterglow of the evening. People occasionally passed near them, acknowledging Ella with a word or a touch of her hand before moving on, but mostly they had a kind of privacy in plain sight. Norman didn't speak immediately. He'd known Ella for 38 years. He understood that some moments required patience before they were ready to be spoken into. Ella sat quietly. The dark glasses were still on. Her hands were in her lap, no longer clasped tightly together. The careful composure of a professional had reassembled itself somewhat, but not completely. She still felt, somehow, more open than usual. She thought about the Houston police station in 1958 and Norman being bailated out with her performance money and telling him, "What's another $2,000? She thought about the Cole Porter recordings in 1956 and Norman saying, "Trust me on this," and choosing to trust. She thought about 1954 when he'd first become her manager, and she'd wondered whether to believe that he was genuinely different from the other managers she'd worked with. He had been different, entirely, consistently, across 38 years different. Then she asked the question, was it real? She said quietly, not loudly, it was barely above the ambient sound of the room around them. All of it, was it real? Did I really do all of that? The question was not entirely about the facts. She knew the facts: 200 albums, 13 Grammys, the concert tour and the recordings and the presidents and the concert halls. She knew those things. What she was asking was something harder to quantify. Did it land? Did it reach people? Did it matter in the way she'd hoped it would matter when she was 18 years old and just beginning, when she'd imagined that music could mean something to people, when she'd believed, not knowing yet whether she was right, that what she had to give was worth giving? Did all of that giving add up to something real? Norman Granz looked at her for a long moment. He thought about everything he'd witnessed. The first time he'd heard her sing and understood immediately that he was in the presence of something genuinely extraordinary. The recording sessions where he'd watched her make take after take, not accepting anything that wasn't right, spending hours on a single phrase until it was exactly what it needed to be. The concert halls in Europe where audiences who didn't even speak English had sat in reverent silence listening to her interpret songs in a language they barely knew. The musicians who'd told him over the years that working with Ella had changed how they understood music. He thought about Whitney Houston 45 minutes ago, not saying Ella's name but meaning it in every word she spoke. Every note of it, Norman said. The answer was 3 words. He said them simply, without drama, with the directness of someone who means what they say and doesn't need to ornament it. Ella was quiet for a long moment after that. Something settled in her, visibly, physically, the way a person's body changes when something they've been carrying finally sets down. Then finally she nodded, once slightly, an acknowledgement. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. The evening had already said what needed to be said in every tribute and every performance and every cleared schedule and every person who had come because Norman called and they could not say no. 60 years of performing, 13 Grammys, 200 albums, the Apollo in 1934, the Macambo in 1955, the Newport Festival in 1960. The Carnegie Hall stages and the jazz clubs and the European concert halls and the White House dinners and the presidential stages and all the ordinary Tuesday nights in cities whose names she sometimes couldn't remember by morning. All of it real, all of it mattering, every note of it. Ella Fitzgerald died 4 years later in 1996. But on April 25, 1992, 75 years old in a wheelchair in a warm room in Los Angeles, she finally knew, without reservation, what she had done and what it meant. Not because she told herself, because the people she had given it to came back and told her. That is the rarest thing in any life, to receive back clearly and completely the meaning of what you have made. Ella received it that night, in every word spoken and every song sung and every person who had come because Norman Granz called and not one person said no. Every note of it, real.